Stick around for more unbelievable stories. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next twist. I never thought floating my houseboat on my own lake would end in flashing lights and officers knocking at my door. But that's exactly how my day went. Not because I broke any law, not because I disturbed anyone, but because my HOA didn't like what they saw. It all started with a decision I'd been planning for years. I wanted to live a little differently, peacefully, closer to nature, and completely on my own terms. So I built a houseboat. Not just any boat though. It was sleek, clean, solar-powered, and fully permitted. And best of all, it floated on my private lake, which I legally owned every inch of it. The moment it touched the water, I felt a kind of freedom most people only dream of. Mornings were quiet, just the sound of birds, gentle ripples, and the occasional fish jumping. I had coffee on the deck. I worked from my small office in the back. It was perfect, but I should have known someone would have a problem with that kind of peace. That someone, of course, was the HOA. Now, to be clear, I don't live in a typical neighborhood. My property spans acres. The lake is entirely inside my boundary lines. But the HOA oversees a nearby community, and for some reason, they believe they have power over anything within sight of their manicured roads. And my floating houseboat? That apparently crossed the line. At first, it was passive-aggressive notes. Stuff like, houseboats may not be allowed under community rules, slipped under my gate. Then came the emails, cold, formal threats dressed in legal-sounding nonsense. I replied to everyone with the same thing. I live on private land, this lake is mine, and I'm not under your jurisdiction. Still, they didn't back down. The more I ignored them, the louder they got. One morning, just after I stepped out with a mug of coffee, I noticed an SUV parked near the main trail that leads to my dock. A woman stood outside, arms crossed, phone in hand. Yep, it was the HOA president, Karen. And not just watching, she was actively taking pictures. I called out, politely but firmly, to ask what she was doing. She shouted back that I was violating the lake view and that I'd hear from authorities soon. I just laughed it off and went back inside. After all, what could they do? Turns out, calling the cops wasn't an empty threat. That weekend, just as I was settling in for a movie night on board, I heard the unmistakable sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires. Red and blue lights bounced off the water. Two sheriff's deputies walked down the slope toward my dock. I stepped outside, surprised but calm. One of them called out asking if I lived there. Said yes. Then he said they got a call about someone illegally occupying the lake. I almost laughed. But instead, I simply pointed behind me and said, "You mean my lake?" They exchanged a look, probably thinking this was going to be one of those strange, dragged-out calls. I invited them aboard, showed them my deed, the property lines, and even the approved permits I had for everything. One officer took a slow walk around the dock, looking impressed. The other leaned in and asked, "So the HOA's been harassing you over this?" I nodded. He sighed, then said something I never expected to hear. "Well, this is clearly your land. You're not breaking any laws. Sorry for the trouble." That moment stuck with me. Not because I wanted the apology, but because it confirmed what I already knew. I hadn't just built a houseboat. I'd taken a stand for my own space, my right to live how I wanted, and not let someone else's rules bleed into my peace. But this wasn't the end. That night sparked something much bigger. And the way things unfolded from there? Let's just say the HOA got more than they bargained for. After the cops left that night, things didn't quiet down like I'd hoped. In fact, they got louder. The apology from the sheriff might have shut the HOA down temporarily, but Karen wasn't the kind of person to let go that easily. A normal person would feel embarrassed after sending law enforcement on a pointless call. But Karen? She doubled down. Within 48 hours, she started rallying the HOA board and the neighborhood Facebook group with one mission: to get my houseboat off the lake. They started spreading lies, saying I was polluting the water, that I was dumping waste into the lake, that I had illegal electrical lines running under the water. I couldn't believe it. I had solar panels, a full filtration system, and better waste management than half the houses around here. But once someone like Karen starts whispering poison in people's ears, the noise spreads fast. Suddenly, neighbors who'd never said a word to me were posting angry comments online and calling county offices trying to report me. The thing is, I had already anticipated this. Before I put one screw into my houseboat, I met with legal consultants, checked state and county regulations, and had every detail documented and approved. They couldn't touch me legally, but that didn't stop them from trying every other way. One afternoon, I noticed something odd. A couple of HOA members were flying a drone over my lake. I could hear the soft buzzing above as I sat on the deck, reading. They were recording, circling the boat like they were collecting evidence for a crime that didn't exist. I waved at the camera with a smirk, then went inside and called my lawyer. The drone footage? Another violation, this time their violation. You can't fly drones for surveillance over private property without permission. But Karen and her crew thought they were building a case. All they were really doing was adding to mine. Things escalated again a few days later. This time, I found a warning sign staked into the trail that led to my dock. It read, "Notice, unauthorized watercraft will be reported and removed." It looked official at a glance, printed on thick laminated paper with HOA branding at the top. But the language was vague and clearly targeted at me. No one else had watercraft on this lake, just me. And it wasn't unauthorized. I pulled the sign out of the ground, took pictures, and filed a complaint with the county sheriff's office. Tampering with personal property signage like that borders on intimidation, and I wasn't going to play along. Instead of getting angry, I documented everything. I kept records. Every sign, every drone flight, every nasty message from the board, even Karen's wild Facebook rants. And while I stayed calm, I could feel something shifting. Karen had gone too far, and now even some of her own neighbors were starting to question what she was doing. A couple of folks from the nearby subdivision quietly messaged me, saying they didn't agree with her and that she was embarrassing the whole community. One of them told me that Karen had tried to get the HOA to issue a fine against me, even though I wasn't a member of the HOA. She was obsessed. She argued that because my lake could be seen from the road that passed through the neighborhood, it affected their property values. Imagine that, someone saying your own private home is a problem just because they can see it from a distance. I kept to myself during all this. No big confrontations. No dramatic arguments. Just peace, paperwork, and patience. I knew the law was on my side. But at the same time, I could feel the tension building. Karen wasn't just losing this little battle, she was losing control, and people were starting to notice. What she didn't know was that I had one more card up my sleeve. Something she'd never expect. Because this wasn't just about a houseboat anymore. It was about who really had the right to decide how I live on my own land. And she was about to get a lesson she wouldn't forget. A few days later, I woke up to find something strange. The dock leading to my houseboat was blocked. Someone had dragged 2 massive planters across the trail during the night. They weren't mine, and they sure weren't there the day before. I stepped over them, curious but calm, and walked up to check the entrance gate. A fresh sign had been zip-tied to the post. It said, in bold red letters, "Private Trail, Access Revoked." I laughed out loud. The trail sits entirely on my land. The dock? Built by me, maintained by me, and not even close to HOA territory. Yet here they were again, trying to claim power where they had none. I took pictures of everything, moved the planters out of the way, and sent it all to my lawyer. Still, I could feel it now. The HOA was pushing harder. They didn't care about laws or lines anymore. This had turned into something personal. Later that afternoon, I got a call. It was from someone on the HOA board, one of the quieter ones. He sounded uncomfortable and almost apologetic. He told me Karen had called an emergency board meeting. She wanted to file for a community injunction against me. When I asked on what grounds, he hesitated and then admitted, "She says your boat's a hazard, and it looks unneighborly." Whatever that meant. I thanked him for the heads up and hung up. That's when I decided it was time to show Karen and the HOA exactly how much ground they'd lost. The next morning, I arranged a small event, a lakeside barbecue for a few friends, just to enjoy the day. I didn't send out invitations. I didn't post online. I just grilled burgers, turned on some soft music, and let life carry on as normal. And wouldn't you know it? Within an hour, Karen showed up. She didn't come alone. She brought a clipboard, a measuring tape, and a camera crew, or at least 2 HOA volunteers acting like one. She didn't even greet anyone. She walked straight to the dock, started taking measurements, and loudly declared, "This structure exceeds shoreline regulations." That's when I stepped in. I calmly asked her to leave my property. She refused. I reminded her that trespassing on private land was a real crime. She smirked and said the HOA had the right to inspect visible community hazards. That's when I called the same sheriff's office from before. When the deputies arrived this time, they knew exactly who she was. They walked straight up to her and asked if she had permission to be there. She puffed herself up and started rambling about bylaws, neighborhood standards, and her duty to the community. But they cut her off. "Ma'am, this is not HOA land," one of them said flatly. "You can't enforce anything here. If the homeowner asks you to leave, you leave." Karen looked stunned. She tried to argue, but the officers weren't having it. They warned her that if she came back without permission, she could face charges. She turned red, shoved her clipboard into her bag, and stormed off without another word. Everyone at the barbecue just stood there watching. It was silent for a moment, then someone clapped. Just one person. Then another. And before I knew it, the whole group burst out cheering. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because they just witnessed what happens when you stand your ground with truth and calm instead of shouting and chaos. That night, I sat on the deck of my houseboat with a drink in hand. The sky was clear, the lake was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something lift. Karen had been told by law enforcement no less that she had no say over my life. But something told me she wasn't done just yet. People like her never take no for an answer. She'd try again. I knew it. And that was fine. Because by now, I wasn't just ready, I was 10 steps ahead. The very next week, just as I was settling back into a routine, another surprise hit me, but this time, it wasn't from Karen directly. It came in the form of an official-looking envelope taped to the front gate of my property. No stamp, no mail carrier. Someone had walked up and stuck it there by hand. I peeled it off and opened it slowly, half expecting more empty threats. But this time, they were stepping it up. Inside was a formal letter, on HOA letterhead, stating that they had voted unanimously to place my floating structure under investigation for violating community harmony guidelines. They claimed I was in breach of visual standards, water usage rights, and public nuisance codes. I laughed out loud. Harmony guidelines? On a lake surrounded by nothing but trees, birds, and silence? I could throw a rock and not hit a neighbor. My property wasn't just private, it was isolated. But this was clearly their next move. If they couldn't get me kicked off legally, they'd try to bury me in fake policies, pretend rules, and intimidation. I knew what they were doing, and I wasn't going to play along. Still, I forwarded the letter to my lawyer just in case. His response came quickly, legally meaningless. But save everything. They're digging their own hole. That same day, I got a knock at my door. Not the boat door, my main cabin up on the hill. It was a man in a suit, middle-aged, clean-shaven, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as a property standards consultant sent by the HOA. I asked if he was licensed. He dodged the question. I asked what authority he had to be on my property. He showed me a generic business card with no official seal or affiliation. I told him he had 5 seconds to walk back to his car or I'd call the sheriff again. He left, muttering something about escalation and non-compliance. At that point, I knew I had to start turning their nonsense into evidence. So I installed 2 extra security cameras, one near the trail leading to the dock and one facing the entrance gate. And sure enough, within days, those cameras picked up gold. First, one of Karen's HOA buddies was spotted sneaking around near the edge of the lake with a long pole, trying to measure something in the water. Then another neighbor came by and tried to snap photos through the trees. Both were clearly trespassing. I posted the clips online, not publicly, just in a small landowners forum I'm a part of. The reactions came pouring in. Other people had dealt with HOAs like this too. Turns out, Karen's type isn't unique. There are plenty of self-important board members who think they rule more than they actually do. And just like me, Many had pushed back, and won. A few even messaged me with legal tips and stories of how they'd gotten their HOAs to back off using county complaints and even lawsuits. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. And Karen? She was actually losing ground fast. By now, the situation was becoming the talk of the local area. A few people from town reached out, curious about the lake house drama. Some even asked if I gave tours. I didn't, obviously, but it was hilarious to see how this personal power trip Karen was on had now turned into a community soap opera, and not in the way she'd hoped. What really sent things over the edge, though, was what happened one evening just before sunset. I was out on the deck of the houseboat, grilling some dinner, when I noticed something shiny bobbing in the water. At first, I thought it was just debris. But as I got closer, I realized it was a small plastic sign floating just offshore. I pulled it out. It read, "This lake is under HOA review. All activity will be reported." They had thrown it in the water. No stake. No permission. Just a floating threat meant to intimidate. That was the final straw. I took pictures, dried it off, and filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office, again. But this time, I also contacted the county water board and sent them everything I had. The drone footage. The sign. The fake inspections. The trespassing. Every paper trail. I wasn't going to fight dirty. I wasn't going to scream. But I was done playing defense. It was time to shift gears. Because when someone tries this hard to control what doesn't belong to them, they eventually slip. And when they do, the fall is loud. The county water board didn't take long to respond. A week after I sent everything, I got a call from their compliance officer. Her tone was polite but direct. She thanked me for the detailed documentation and confirmed something I already knew. No HOA has the authority to regulate private waterways unless it's specifically outlined in a legal covenant. And in my case, there was no such clause, no easement, no shared ownership. The lake was mine. Period. She also mentioned that the floating sign they threw in the water could actually qualify as unauthorized littering under state environmental laws. That caught my attention. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it made sense. The HOA wasn't just being aggressive, they were breaking real rules in their attempt to enforce fake ones. She said someone from her department would be paying the area a visit soon. I didn't know it then, but that visit would change everything. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't slowing down. A few days later, I got another letter, hand-delivered and left on my porch. This time, it was addressed to the occupant of the floating residence, which made me laugh. Inside was a typed, rambling list of violations, including things like visual disruption of natural scenery, unauthorized solar energy use, and even possible boat horn noise pollution. I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried. Every item was vague, ridiculous, or flat-out made up. I didn't even bother replying. Instead, I just added it to my growing folder. At this point, I was collecting HOA nonsense like trading cards. Then came the cherry on top. It was a quiet Saturday morning. I was inside the houseboat, halfway through breakfast, when I heard someone shouting near the dock. I stepped outside and once again found Karen pacing back and forth near the shoreline, waving her phone in the air. She was filming a live video, complaining loudly about unregulated structures and reckless behavior on community waters. I stood there, arms crossed, not saying a word. She didn't even look at me, just kept talking to her imaginary audience, clearly trying to provoke me on camera. But this time, she picked the wrong moment. While she was still filming, a county-marked SUV pulled up near the trail entrance. The compliance officer I'd spoken with stepped out and began walking toward the lake. Karen noticed her immediately and tried to intercept her halfway down the path, likely assuming they were there to help her. I watched from a distance, trying not to laugh. The officer calmly explained who she was and that she was responding to my complaint, not Karen's. Karen's smile vanished in real time. They spoke for a few minutes, and then the officer turned and walked straight toward me. She asked if she could take a look at the dock, the boat, and the solar setup. I welcomed her aboard. I gave her a brief tour and showed her the files I'd prepared. She examined everything, took notes, snapped a few pictures, and then simply said, "Everything here appears to be fully in order. Thank you for cooperating." She turned back toward the trail, where Karen was still standing, arms folded, waiting for what she probably thought was a report in her favor. But the officer didn't sugarcoat it. She told her plainly, within earshot of everyone nearby, that the HOA had no standing here. That this lake was privately owned. That any further interference could be considered harassment. Karen tried to protest, but the officer cut her off and told her to take her concerns elsewhere, because this matter was closed. Karen stood there stunned. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She just turned and walked back to her car, clearly shaken. And for the first time, I realized something. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was embarrassed. The walls were closing in, and all the noise, all the drama she stirred up, was starting to backfire. After that day, things around the lake felt different. Not quieter exactly, but the tension had shifted. I could sense Karen was regrouping, maybe planning something else, but now, the law was on record. And people were watching. Not just the neighbors. Not just the board. But actual authorities. And that changed everything. A few days after the county officer's visit, I got an unexpected visitor, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It was Mark, one of my old neighbors from before the HOA ever formed. He used to own a place 2 properties over but sold it before Karen and her crew took over. We shared a beer on the dock and watched the sunset roll across the lake. After a while, he leaned back and said, "I heard you've stirred up a hornet's nest out here." I just smiled and told him, "I didn't stir anything. I just didn't run." He laughed and nodded. Then he told me something I didn't know. Apparently, this wasn't Karen's first time pulling stunts like this. Back when she first joined the HOA board, she had tried to force another neighbor to remove his backyard gazebo because she claimed it blocked her sunrise view. That fight had gone on for months until the man finally sold and moved away. Same pattern. Different victim. Hearing that made me realize just how many people Karen must have steamrolled over the years, using fear, fake rules, and that passive-aggressive tone she was so famous for. But this time, things were different. This time, someone stood up and said, "No." Mark's visit wasn't the only unexpected moment that week. One morning, I checked my mailbox and found a stack of anonymous letters. No return address, just handwritten notes from neighbors I barely knew. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others said they admired how I handled things calmly and legally. One letter simply said, "Thank you for putting her in her place." That one made me chuckle. I pinned those letters to the corkboard in my cabin. Not out of pride, but as a reminder that people were watching more than I thought. Turns out, standing your ground helps others realize they can too. Even in silence, support was building. But of course, Karen wasn't done. A week later, I noticed a new sign at the entrance of the community, right before the main road that leads out to my trail. It said, "HOA Zone, respect community rules, unauthorized activity will be investigated." It wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but we all knew who it was meant for. The problem? That sign was posted outside HOA boundaries. On county land. That was a mistake. I took a picture and emailed it directly to the county code enforcement office. Within 48 hours, the sign was removed. That same day, a county worker put up a new one in its place. Unauthorized signage prohibited, violators may be fined. I didn't have to lift a finger after that. Karen's games were starting to collapse under their own weight. And she was no longer just bothering me. Now, she was annoying people with real power. The quiet shift I'd started to feel was turning into something bigger. Some board members were starting to question her actions openly. A rumor spread that 2 of them had resigned. One even sent me an email saying he had no interest in getting sued over someone else's obsession. Around that time, I noticed something odd. Karen wasn't showing up as much anymore. Her daily patrols stopped. The drone flights ended. The fake inspectors vanished. For the first time in months, the lake was calm, really calm. I could finally hear the wind in the trees, the splash of fish jumping, and the steady creak of my dock rocking gently under the sunset. It felt like life was returning to normal, or at least what normal should have been all along. But I stayed alert. People like Karen don't just give up. They wait, they regroup, they reappear. I knew that silence could be temporary. Still, I wasn't nervous anymore. I'd built a wall around myself, not with fences or cameras, but with facts, law, and patience. And that wall was holding strong. One evening, as I sat on my deck with a warm cup of coffee, I spotted something floating across the lake. For a second, I tensed. But as it got closer, I saw what it was: a paper lantern drifting peacefully across the water. Not a threat, not a message, just something someone let go into the wind. I watched it glide along the surface until it faded into the dusk. In that moment, I didn't think about the HOA. I didn't think about Karen. I didn't even think about the battles I'd fought. I just sat there, listening to the soft lap of water, surrounded by the quiet I had fought so hard to protect. The calm didn't last long. Just when it felt like things were finally back to normal, I got a letter in the mail, but not from the HOA this time. It was from a law firm, addressed directly to me, and stamped urgent. I opened it with the same quiet focus I'd developed over the past few months. Inside was a formal cease and desist notice, accusing me of operating a commercial marina on a residential lake. I read it twice, then once more. A commercial marina? I didn't even rent out paddle boats. It was absurd. But it told me one important thing: Karen had escalated again. This wasn't just another passive-aggressive letter from the board. This was her trying to bring in legal firepower, hoping the threat alone would scare me. What she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this exact moment since the first drone flew overhead. I called my attorney and emailed him the documents. His response was calm, almost amused. He told me the claims were hollow. There was no evidence, no legal basis, and no actual law I was violating. It was pure bluff, another swing in the dark. He told me not to worry, but to respond officially, just to document everything. So we did. In the reply, my lawyer laid out every bit of proof: property records, zoning laws, water rights, and environmental approvals. He even included a copy of the original deed that clearly showed the lake as private and fully contained within my land. It was the legal version of slamming the door shut, politely. A week went by. Then two. And just when I thought it might finally settle, something happened that even I didn't see coming. I got a call from the local news. Apparently, someone, probably Karen, had leaked parts of the dispute to a local reporter, trying to frame it as a neighborhood safety issue. The story was spun like I was some rogue homeowner building unauthorized structures and ignoring the rules of the community. They wanted to do a piece on it, get both sides, and let the public weigh in. I hesitated at first. I didn't like the idea of turning my personal life into a headline. But then I realized this was actually a chance to tell the truth. So I agreed, but only under one condition: the reporter had to visit in person and see the property with their own eyes. The next day, a small team showed up. They weren't what I expected, just one guy with a mic and a camerawoman. I walked them around, showed them the houseboat, the dock, the solar panels, and all the paperwork. I explained everything calmly and clearly, just like I had done with the sheriff and the county board. No drama, no anger, just facts. When they left, they thanked me for being open and honest. I didn't think much of it until 3 days later, when the story aired. It wasn't a hit piece. In fact, it leaned heavily in my favor. The headline read, "Private Lake Owner Harassed by HOA Over Legal Houseboat." The footage showed my quiet lake, my small but neat houseboat, and clips of me explaining my side. There was even a short segment of the county official stating clearly that the HOA had no authority on the property. Karen must have seen it too, because the fallout was immediate. That night, I got more messages than ever before. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before reached out to say they were embarrassed by the HOA's behavior. One even dropped off a pie with a sticky note on top that said, "For the guy who stood up." But it wasn't the pie or the compliments that surprised me most. It was the silence that followed. No more letters. No more threats. No more signs. Karen disappeared from view. She stopped walking the trails, stopped sending emails, stopped showing up to board meetings. It was like she vanished into thin air. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just went out to the dock that evening, sat down with a quiet drink, and looked out over the water. The same lake she had tried so hard to control. The same boat she said didn't belong. Still there. Still mine. And more peaceful than ever. Thanks for watching. If this made you smile, consider subscribing for more HOA chaos and sweet revenge.